You're listening to Radio VR with me, Juliet Spare. New restrictions are being introduced in England and Wales to curtail one of the most controversial powers in policing, stop and search. Stop and search is when a police officer stops someone that they have reasonable grounds to suspect is carrying either drugs, weapons or stolen property, or items which could be used to carry out a crime or used in connection with violence, and then searches their clothing or any bag they're carrying. The officer must explain why they have grounds for searching the person they are stopping. But according to Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, 27% of searches conducted last year did not contain reasonable grounds for suspicion, and concern remains over the most controversial aspect of stop and search, in that it is disproportionately used against people from a black or minority ethnic background. Meanwhile, Britain's Home Secretary Theresa May has announced new measures to scale back the way in which police can use their stop and search powers, which includes making it compulsory for police to record whether or not a stop and search has led to an arrest. Taking part in a discussion about stop and search is James Whitfield, a former Metropolitan Police Inspector who retired in 1999. Benjamin Bowling, Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at King's College London, and member of StopWatch, an action group which aims to address excess and disproportionate stop and search. Fahim Alam, director and producer of Riots Reframed, a documentary which looks at England's 2011 riots through the voices of resistance. And Kirsty Dowes, head of legal services at Release, the UK's National Centre of Expertise on Drugs and Drugs Laws. Now, I'm going to start with you, please, James Whitfield, as a former Metropolitan Police Inspector. Can you put stop and search into a historical context for us in terms of the policing in Britain?
I think it'd be fair to say, and I'm open to being criticised for saying this, but I think in its controversial sense, stop and search has really only come to the fore in the last 50 or 60 years. If we go back to the early part of the 19th century, there was an Act of Parliament, the Vagrancy Act of 1824, which was passed in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. And that introduced us to some characters who, rather strangely to describe now, rogues and vagabonds. And the suspected person, these were acts where people could be arrested for really not doing anything, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, essentially. A few years after that, the Metropolitan Police were given powers to stop, search and detain people in possession of stolen goods and the like. And similar powers were given to large urban areas to coincide with those of the Metropolitan Police. But outside those areas, there was really no great power to stop and search. And you had what grew up in policing terms to be known as the Ways and Means Act. In other words, no legal power to stop people, but we'll stop them anyway. After the war, and certainly with the rise in immigration and the associated prejudice and discrimination, people realised that particularly what became known as the Sus Law was discriminatory in its operation. And that was abolished in 1981. And 3 years later, in its place, a power was introduced throughout England and Wales under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, Section 1, which clarified the power to stop and search. And that is the law we have today.
And in your experience as a police officer in London, how successful do you think, or how damaging has stop and search been on community relations with the police?
I think we get mixed messages, particularly from politicians. And you've raised the point about Theresa May and the proposed changes to stop and search. And while it's being criticised by politicians and across the board, generally speaking, you'll often hear the same politicians saying, but it's an essential tool used properly that the police need to have. So perhaps that's an area we can look at today.
Well, just to ask, then, do you think it's an essential tool that the police, if it's used properly, need to have?
Well, I think certainly in terms of my experience of people being stopped and searched, a lot of the complaints were not so much in terms of being stopped and searched, but often in the circumstances under which it was done and the manner in which it was done.
We've got lots of people nodding and agreeing here. We'll come to you, Ben Bowling, Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at King's College London. Explain to us what you've been doing, you say, for the last 20 years with a campaign group called StopWatch.
Okay, so just picking up on James's point about the value of stop and search. So when the Police and Criminal Evidence Act was being debated in Parliament and the sus laws are being abolished, the question was, how should a police officer who sees something suspicious but doesn't have enough evidence to want to arrest somebody, because the whole point about sus was that a person can be arrested merely on suspicion, taken to the police cells, charged with sus, and even convicted on sus. So the debate in Parliament was, can the police be granted a power short of arrest to stop somebody, ask them questions, to carry out a superficial search, to confirm or allay any suspicions they might have about their involvement in crime? To me, that's perfectly sensible. If a police officer has a genuine suspicion that somebody, for example, is, has been accused by another member of the public, for example, that person over there has got a knife. I think it's perfectly reasonable for a police officer to approach somebody and say, this person over there said, you've got a knife, would you mind just showing me, what's in the bag? So that's the original intention of the power, as a power short of arrest to basically to confirm or allay any suspicions. Unfortunately, what happened was that the police used the power as a kind of catch-all fishing expedition kind of power, where the boundaries of what's defined as reasonable suspicion are so broadly drawn that the police seem to feel able to stop and search somebody even on the merest of suspicions. So what you find is that if, in the early research, police officers were asked, why were you stopping that person? The main grounds for suspicion were running, hurrying, or loitering, which basically means that anybody who isn't walking purposefully, anybody who's standing on a street corner, could even be waiting for a bus. Police officer say, here's a person loitering at a bus stop. Excuse me, sir, would you mind, if I could go through your pockets? To which the answer should be, on what grounds do you suspect me? What tends to happen then is that the police officer then experiences or says that a person who questions why they're being searched has sort of answered their own question. If you ask, why are you searching me? Why are you stopping me? It's to answer your own question. That means you're obstreperous, you failed the attitude test, and therefore often police officers will use somebody's sort of resistance to being searched as the grounds for a search. And the consequence of that is often conflict. You sometimes have people who are arrested for being obstructing the police, and you've got allegations of assault on the police, assaults of members of the public arising from what has turned into a major flashpoint. Stop and search has in many ways poisoned the relationship between police and community. Its yield in terms of the numbers of people who are found in possession of contraband, of weapons and so on, is relatively small by comparison with the numbers of people stopped. So my view is, and I think the evidence bears this out, that it actually causes, in general, more harm than good.
I think I'll come to you, Fahim. We heard from Ben there, it was like a catch-all fishing technique, not specific enough at times. Was there anything that Ben said there and what you've heard from James so far that reminded you of your experience, and in which case you could sort of share that with us?
I wanted to go back slightly, though, to the history, because I think that this kind of form of fishing for, as you say, rogues and vagabonds goes much further. So our police model here is somewhat based on the police model in America, and the American police model is based on plantation slavery, where those fishing expeditions, as was mentioned, were based on race and class. So it was there particularly to police a certain race of people and to police a certain class of people within that society, the slave class. So we can go much further in the history of white supremacy to understand the structure of this and how it works. So really stop and search is a really old mechanism in many ways, and with these reforms it feels like the new forms of control of parts of the populace are taking place. So I wanted to add that part of history because I think it's important. My experience, I have other forms of knowledge too. So I did my master's dissertation on stop and search in the Terrorism Act, Section 44, but I've also been stopped and searched under every law that you mentioned, and had many different interactions with the police. So for me, it's very important to understand the function of police in any society, the function of police in this society, the role that they play, because let's not be fooled. We are still talking about, even if reformed, we are still talking about the stop and search of a particular part of the population. The gentleman on my left will still not be sort of have problems with stop and search under the new reforms. So that is very important to understand, that the same conversation exists, but we're moving to newer technologies of violence that will be used to control people.
By newer technologies, are you inferring to cameras? Or
Well, okay, so for example, DNA, the collection of DNA from suspects or people who have been arrested, and even those who have not been, where there's been an NFA, no further action, the DNA is kept of those people. Fingerprint technology that was originally used and experimented with in colonial spaces such as Fallujah. So the fingerprint technology that's been used on the roadsides has come out of military technology, which is often the case, where these war zones are theatres or laboratories of violence. What else? I mean, the police, and this is with the kind of permission and campaigning of the left, the police are now starting to wear cameras or have more cameras. And I think what's happening is that there's a more concentrated approach. So you may be stopped and searched less, but when they come, they will come with tasers and or guns, and or all the other technologies that they will use, or face recognition technology. So those military forms of technology that are becoming sort of the precision tools of control.
Okay, so we're talking about the precision controls there, but to bring Kirsty Dowse into the discussion, you're head of legal services at a charity called Release, which is the National Centre of Expertise on Drugs and Drugs Law. Having heard historical, future, current perceptions and experiences of stop and search, how do you see your role, or how do you see policy helping in any way?
Well, I think, as you said, looking at past, present and future, it's clear that very little has changed, actually. Any reforms are insignificant. Touching on certain sectors of society being more subjected to stop and search than others, that's exactly the case as it is now. Nothing has changed there. Our interest as an organisation, as a drugs charity, stemmed from the fact, as you mentioned at the start, that one of the reasons that somebody can be stopped and searched is on the suspicion that they are in possession of controlled drugs. We have, over many years, received regular reports from our clients that they've been stopped and searched on dubious grounds, perhaps because an officer says they've smelt cannabis, even in a vehicle that has the windows shut, and there's no possibility that they could have actually done that. That's just one example. So we were aware that a large proportion of the stop and searches occurring in England and Wales were occurring under the premise that controlled drugs were in the possession of that individual. So last year we conducted some research with the London School of Economics, and our suspicions were borne out, and that all but 3 of the forces in England and Wales conducted reported stop and search for drugs as the highest type of stop and search that they were carrying out. And as Ben mentioned earlier, then if we look at the outcome of those stop and searches, then we can determine whether or not those reasonable suspicions were in fact correct. If you look at drugs specifically, there's an arrest rate of only 7% from those who are stopped and searched. I think that's not a success in anybody's estimations at all. it's very clear there that then drugs and drug policing are driving stop and search. And touching on something Fahim said, that if you drill down further into that, drugs are then driving racial disparity in stop and search. So black people and Asian people are much more likely to be stopped and searched for many offences, but specifically for drugs in our experience and as the results of our research show, much more likely to be stopped and searched than white people.
To pick up on
yes, please, Ben.
On the point about the drug searches and reasonable suspicion, it strikes me as utterly absurd that only 7% of those instances where a police officer has some kind of claims to have some kind of reasonable suspicion that a person is in possession of drugs, and it turns out that only 7 times in every 100 is that suspicion confirmed. You know, when I talk with my students about what they think will be a reasonable proportion of people who turn out to have been accurately identified as a suspicious person, they usually start at about the 70 or 80% mark. You know, if you've got reasonable grounds that someone's in possession of drugs, you should be sure you should be correct at least more often than not. And I think that this suggests that the police continue to abuse the power by going out and simply stopping and searching people on a whim. But I do want to say something positive about the current debate, because although I think that stop and search continues to be abused and it continues to, be a way of oppressing people who are, from ethnic minorities, black and Asian people, and people who live in urban areas and the poorest and most marginalised society, I do think that it's not that nothing has changed. I think for me that's important. So Section 44 of the Terrorism Act, for example, was accounting for, hundreds of thousands of searches. And as a consequence of campaigning and ultimately the European Court of Human Rights, Section 44 has been abolished, and it's been replaced with a power which, to my knowledge, hasn't yet been used. Section 60 of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, which allowed police officers to search people without suspicion, has now been so radically curtailed that it's happening with increasing rarity. And what Theresa May's proposals have done is to raise the level of authorisation. So you now have to have a chief officer putting the authorisation in place. It's for a shorter period of time. And I think that what we're going to see is Section 60 essentially coming to be all very rarely used. So I think what I'm saying is that although stop and search remains as a kind of, a running sore, as poisoning the relationship between police and community, it continues to be a mechanism for control, notwithstanding the new technologies, which I think is important. I kind of think as a researcher and also as an activist that it's self-defeating to say nothing ever works. That, we've got 2.5 decades of campaigning and research and action on stop and search, and the last 5 years particularly important. And I think what we're seeing is gradually and slowly and painstakingly some aspects of policing being brought back under community control. I mean, just to take one example out of this, Theresa May's new policy is the possibility of people accompanying police and observing stop and search practice. At the moment, if a person films a police officer carrying out a stop and search, what you might well find is the police officer saying, "Why are you filming? Stop that," and arresting the person filming. And I think that what this document has the potential to do, and only the potential, is to actually institutionalise what I would call surveillance, the capacity of ordinary people to actually observe what the police do, to film it, to report it, to complain against it. We've got lots of instances in England over the last few years where action by ordinary members of the community have actually brought the police back under control. And that's what I would hope for. And I think there is some potential for that. I'd like to go further.
Just before we come to you, James, it was just a comment that we talked about the 7 in 100 arrests resulting in the suspicions from a police officer. And with Section 60, it has to be under the control or the decision of a chief officer. What does that say about police discretion or emotional intelligence?
Well, if you speak to police officers nowadays, they will tell you they've had that discretion taken away from them with regard to many instances. The thing I wanted to mention was the fact that I did some research into stop and search based on figures for 2005. And I asked a friend of mine, how many times does an officer stop someone over an average year? And she said, 1 a day, stop and search. And I got some figures from the Home Office and calculated those figures against the number of operational police officers that year. And the average, obviously there are more, some officers do lots more, but the average police officer did 9 stop and searches a year.
Is that 9 too many or 9 too few?
Well, it is 9. It is a total, a grand total of 9, an average of about 1 every 5.5 weeks. Now, I wanted to relate that back to Theresa May's latest pronouncements about the time taken up in doing the paperwork for stop and search and how time-consuming it is for police officers. And relate that to an address she gave to the Police Federation back in 2010, where she abolished the need for police officers to make records on stop and question. Now, one can argue, is stop and search worse than stop and question? But I believe that if you are a black ethnic minority and you are in the habit of being stopped regularly by the police, and the police don't have to make a record of the times they stop and question you, how are you ever going to prove that you're being victimized?
Yeah. And that's where Ben's point about it being, the poison to police and community relations. Fahim, you've been writing furiously there. Are there some points you want to pick up on?
So many points. Let's talk about discretion. I think discretion is important to an extent, but policy dictates what the police do, where they go. How they do it is kind of the intro, but the relationship between the police and the public, etc., and the state is very clear and defined. And it seems like, I don't know, I've just picked up on the kind of implication that what we're asking is for the police to be more effective against poor people. And so it still is a discussion, again, by the elite establishment, Theresa May and David Cameron and whoever else, about the policing of poor people, black people, brown people, working class people, etc., men predominantly. So the discourse hasn't changed. There's a change within the discourse, but the discourse has not been radicalized or revolutionized. And funnily enough, that is what Theresa May, that's the kind of stance that she's taken, that this is about justice or whatever else, which to me looks like a distraction. This kind of supposed conflict between Theresa May's reforms and David Cameron's going tough on policy allows the government to have the best of both audiences.
Going back to the point we said about discretion, and obviously, James, you said it. You have spoken to police officers that say it doesn't exist, and that reminded you. For our discussion, would you be able to briefly explain that after the 2011 riots, when you were yourself a victim of discretion?
Well, I mean, there was discretion there. I mean, I would even argue, I would even go as far as arguing that discretion was, in a sense, reasonable. I wouldn't argue that. I may go as far as arguing that because of the way I was dressed, etc., etc. So on that day, I mean, anyone who was dressed the way I was and who was brown and on the road was subject to that kind of treatment. But
could you just say what happened?
Okay, so I was on the streets of Hackney coming back from work, going to my nan's. I came across riots. So I stood around and was watching what was going on. The roads cleared eventually, and I was chased down by 6 or 7 officers and arrested and basically remanded. I spent 2 days in the police station and remanded in custody. Was there for 6 weeks. And then I was on tag for 6 months, and I went to trial and I was acquitted. But, I mean, it's kind of like an expansion of what happens every day on the roads. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of related, but it's not. It's about. I mean, when I was walking before I had reached the crowds, for example, I saw that same van, and because I had a certain type of scarf on, I was wearing black clothes, and I had a side bag. They were already looking at me. They slowed down the van, but I mean, it's complicated because during the riots you could have been any race, but on a day to day, your different things come into account. I just want to go back to something that was said about sort of trying to minimise the understanding of kind of the impact of stop and search. I think you were saying that it amounts to like one every 5 weeks or something, or something minuscule. But I mean, the figures need to be looked at in relation to geography as well, and in relation to particular communities. So, for example, we spoke about the history in the sus laws. That was one of the triggers for the riots in the 80s in Brixton, and that was related. And this term keeps being thrown about ethnic minorities, and my position here is related to the global. Black and brown people's relation to this country, to this state, to this city, necessarily relates to the global, to the international. So we need to keep that in mind and understand that these are the reason that these people are being stopped and treated in this way is because of their relationship to the global majority, right? And
has that changed over time?
I mean, ultimately, the vision of the state, people like Theresa May, is securitocracy. It's to securitize power over the poor.
I think if you look back to the 50s and 60s, a lot of the people who were the new immigrants, if you like, who were being victimized, what many of them wanted, those people wanted, was to be treated equally. They wanted the same treatment as everyone. Are you saying that's changed?
Well, what I was going to say was, if we connect this to the sus laws, back in the 80s, there was what led to those Brixton riots was Operation Swamp. Now, prior to that, Margaret Thatcher had given a speech that we are being swamped by these people. And you have the kind of resonance in what David Cameron says. And when Margaret Thatcher said, in response to those riots, criminality, 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 and then kind of Cameron sort of reiterated that with criminality pure and simple. It just shows that the ideology has not changed, right? There may be changes. Well, there are changes in the technology and in social situations. The fact that we can film, for example, something was said about people being able to film the police. People can already film the police. That's in the law. So when they introduce cameras, that's maybe more beneficial for them because it allows them to collect their own evidence.
What cameras have helped in your situation when you were arrested?
Well, actually, the absence of them helped me, I guess, because there was no evidence. But they did have.
That's what I mean. Wouldn't the lack of evidence have
But there was
helped
a
you?
CCTV still, wasn't there, which showed you away from the group? Was that?
Yeah, I mean, there was like 10 seconds of some handheld. I don't know what kind of camera it was. It was a police camera though. There was 10 seconds of me standing amongst a group of people, but I was independent of anybody else. But the way that was used was the still that was used showed me amongst a particular group of people. But when you played it, and the camera panned slightly, there was like, families and kids and like a woman with a summery dress walking with her flip-flops on, and it just looked kind of calmer. So that's another form of propaganda. But I mean,
to contextualise it for you.
Yeah, can I just mention one quick thing?
Yeah.
During the threat to aircraft at Heathrow, when there was some suspicion that a surface-to-air missile had been commandeered and planes were in fear of being shot out of the sky, I was still at Royal Holloway College at the time. And I set off to Royal Holloway one day, and in the 5 miles that I went through to get to Royal Holloway, I went through 14 roadblocks. I wasn't stopped once. And there was quite a furore about the victimization of Asian people. And what you got is the police officers at Heathrow Airport, because they'd been criticized for stopping people of Asian appearance, were told, you've got to stop more white people. And you had the ludicrous situation where police officers with roadblocks, armed police officers, were stopping mum, dad and the kids going shopping because they wanted to equalise the numbers of stop and search.
But that highlights again that where we go back to kind of the discretion being taken away, and it's just all centralised.
It's a very superficial response, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? We haven't heard much from Kirsty here. This discussion on stop and search sort of highlights so many issues. We could go on for a long time. But I guess it probably highlights the issues surrounding the drugs laws in this country. Absolutely.
It certainly highlights the fact that the drugs laws in this country aren't working. And when we just look at, look at the racial disparity, which obviously our report revealed, or confirmed, in fact, it didn't reveal it, we always knew it existed. This is, so black people are 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs. They're 6 times more likely to be arrested for drugs offences. But when you look at the rates of drug use in various different communities, that is in the context of white communities using far more drugs than either black or Asian communities. So if you're using reasonable suspicion of that community using drugs, it doesn't fit. The discretion is being exercised wrongly. And then what you have is that the racial disparity, which appears at stop and search, continues on throughout the criminal justice system. You then set the ball rolling, and you end up, if you look at London in particular, you then end up with, for instance, black people receiving cannabis warnings at 3 times the rate of white people, being charged for possession of cannabis at 5 times the rate of white people, and also being charged for cocaine as opposed to getting a police caution at a much higher rate. So our research showed 78% of black people were charged with possession of cocaine, whilst the remaining 22% received a caution. If you compare that to the results for white people, 44% only were charged, and the remaining 56% received a caution. You then have to look at what damage does that. We obviously have spoken briefly about the damage that the stop and search laws do to policing in the community. But what damage then does criminalising people then have on people? So in Fahim's instance, obviously he was acquitted. There was obviously a real danger there that he could have been convicted, and falsely so. But that would have had a damaging effect on his education, his employment prospects, also his ability to travel to certain countries, particularly the US, who obviously take a very dim view of drug offences. Just going back to your original question, this is why Release as an organisation campaign for the decriminalisation of personal possession of drugs, because it has such a damaging impact on society as a whole, not just at the policing level, where you get communities who don't trust the police, who, if they are a victim of a crime or a witness to a crime, will not go to the police. They try and deal with it themselves because they've had such negative experiences. If you're someone who has been stopped and searched 9 times in a week, as opposed to a police officer stopping 9 people in a year, you're not going to go to the police. They are the enemy, and we need to remember the police's role is as a protector. It's not supposed to be about focusing on the lower classes, people in areas of deprivation, and people of certain races.
I don't think the police ever saw themselves in terms of social reform. They classically define themselves, their role as being the preservation of life and property, the prosecution of and arrest of offenders, and the maintenance of public order. And anything to do with community relations, community involvement, was long way down the list. And in fact, home beat officers, when we still had home beat officers in the police, they were looked upon as superfluous to requirements.
I think that's why the new codes, that's and something Ben touched on earlier, is that we really need to get the community involved, because one of the things is allowing the community to go out and watch stop and searches. But I think communities really need to be empowered to hold the police to account, to complain about it. Obviously, the complaints facility is there, but it's used rarely, simply because people don't have faith in it.
And they don't really know about it either.
Well, it's both, really. Sometimes people do know about it, but they have tried and have had a bad experience, or other people have told them of a bad experience. They haven't got anything out of it. If they're lucky, an apology, or perhaps the police have been, the police officer in question will get some extra training about something. There's either lack of knowledge or just lack of faith in the system.
And that lack of faith in the system is reasonable, because the Independent Police Complaints Commission has unfortunately been really toothless and ineffective. I mean, when people come and ask me specifically about what should I do if I've been wrongfully stopped and searched or something, I say, instruct a solicitor. Don't bother with the IPCC, because most of the time it will be resolved locally with a slap on the wrist, if anything, from the police. Very few cases are resolved. Those cases are resolved result in very, very minimal kind of sanctions. So I think accountability for me is absolutely critical. I mean, I completely agree with you about the way in which the police have historically been used oppressively. And I think there's also a broader relationship with how borders are policed, and also with the criminal justice system and our prisons. And as that connects globally, I think there are some very, very serious problems here. But I still think that it is for us as people engaged in this area to work towards more accountability for the police, and a lot of that's not about policy, but it's about politics and about engagement. So I think an optimistic view of that.
I just wanted to make a point about what Kirsty said. Actually reinforced what I was saying. So I was actually going to ask you during this conversation, what is the likelihood of the gentleman next to me taking drugs over me? And actually, it's probably higher, right?
Absolutely.
And so therefore, this conversation between Theresa May, the public, and whatever else is still about reforming stop and search over poor people. It's not radicalising and paying heed to what the figures actually show. So let's not talk about discretion. Let's talk about policy. Let's talk about statistics. Let's talk about research. Therefore, let's let the police go outside the clubs of Mayfair or the drum and bass raves and stop middle class white people, or Oxford University, and stop middle class white people from taking cocaine, which is a class A substance over a class B or a C substance, as cannabis was previously, which is, again, as you said, an entry point into the criminal justice system, into prison, into this secure autocracy that I'm speaking about. So I just don't want people to be fooled by this, to believe that there's something radical going on. Yes, it's a small step in a certain direction, but it actually makes it more effective. It makes the control that is currently in place more effective for them. And I don't think that communities ultimately win in that situation.
Well, I think there is that certainly is a risk, but it seems to me that the crucial thing for me is about liberty, and that there is a reasonable prospect for, and certainly an argument for, a higher quality of liberty in this country. And unless communities are saying, I will hold the police to account, I will engage with this, seems to me that if you don't engage, then the state wins in terms of its movements towards oppression. And that I think is for us as,
I think it will just become more concentrated oppression. So the ultimate definition of a police state or a secret police state is where, when you breathe or think of a crime, they get you. And that's what we're moving towards. This old thing of stopping anything that breathes and moves that is black or brown or poor is stopping, and we're moving to a more concentrated approach, which I think is more scary ultimately.
Those are the communities that we need to engage with and encourage to hold the police to account, because otherwise by sitting back and doing nothing, then you're succumbing to that, and you're allowing that to continue, and that's why organisations like ours are trying to work with those most vulnerable and exploited communities.
It's interesting to think that policing was never an election manifesto issue until 1966. It was never mentioned prior to that. And perhaps a look around the room, I think possibly we'd all agree that ever since then it's become increasingly politicised. And
militarised.
Of course. And that's a very good point, because if you go to a police training session, in terms of public order training sessions, you'll see police officers being trained how to wield a baton, how to fire a taser, how to use CS spray. You'll never see a police officer being taught how to speak to the public.
That was James Whitfield there, a former Metropolitan Police Inspector. And we were also joined by Benjamin Bowling, Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at King's College London, documentary maker Fahim Alim, and Kirsty Dowse, Head of Legal Services at Release. Of stop and search, in that it is disproportionately used against people from a black or minority ethnic background. Meanwhile, Britain's Home Secretary Theresa May has announced new measures to scale back the way in which police can use their stop and search powers, which includes making it compulsory for police to record whether or not a stop and search has led to an arrest. Taking part in a discussion about stop and search is James Whitfield, a former Metropolitan Police Inspector who retired in 1999. Benjamin Bowling, Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at King's College London, and member of StopWatch, an action group which aims to address excess and disproportionate stop and search. Fahim Alam, director and producer of Riots Reframed, a documentary which looks at England's 2011 riots through the voices of resistance. And Kirsty Dowse, Head of Legal Services at Release, the UK's National Centre of Expertise on Drugs.
Particularly what became known as the SUS law, was discriminatory in its operation. And that was abolished in 1981. And 3 years later, in its place, a power was introduced throughout England and Wales under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, Section 1, which clarified the powers to stop and search. And that is the law we have today.
And in your experience as a police officer in London, how successful do you think, or how damaging has stop and search been on community relations with the police?
I think we get mixed messages, particularly from politicians. And you've raised the point about Theresa May and the proposed changes to stop and search. And while it's being criticised by politicians and
You're listening to Radio VR with me, Juliet Spare. New restrictions are being introduced in England and Wales to curtail one of the most controversial powers in policing, stop and search. Stop and search is when a police officer stops someone that they have reasonable grounds to suspect is carrying either drugs, weapons or stolen property, or items which could be used to carry out a crime or used in connection with violence, and then searches their clothing or any bag they're carrying. The officer must explain why they have grounds for searching the person they are stopping. But according to Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, 27% of searches conducted last year did not contain reasonable grounds for suspicion, and concern remains over the most controversial aspect of drugs and drugs laws. Now, I'm going to start with you, please, James Whitfield, as a former Metropolitan Police Inspector. Can you put stop and search into a historical context for us in terms of the policing in Britain?
I think it'd be fair to say, and I'm open to being criticised for saying this, but I think in its controversial sense, stop and search has really only come to the fore in the last 50 or 60 years. If we go back to the early part of the 19th century, there was an Act of Parliament, the Vagrancy Act of 1824, which was passed in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. And that introduced us to some characters who, rather strangely to describe them now, rogues and vagabonds. And the suspected person, these were acts where people could be arrested for really not doing anything, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, essentially. A few years after that, the Metropolitan Police were given powers to stop, search, and detain people in possession of stolen goods and the like. And similar powers were given to large urban areas to coincide with those of the Metropolitan Police. But outside those areas, there was really no great power to stop and search. And you had what grew up in policing terms to be known as the Ways and Means Act. In other words, no legal power to stop people, but we'll stop them anyway. After the war, and certainly with the rise in immigration and the associated prejudice and discrimination, people realized that the